Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Understanding Users podcast, brought to you by Researchable UX. It's great to have you with me. I'm your host, Mike Green. I'm a freelance user research lead and digital consultant based in the UK. Over the coming weeks, I'm going to be chatting to various digital experts who I've had the pleasure of working with in recent years. They're from various disciplines, including user research, UX design, development, and product management. And they'll even be a digital business owner or two. I'll be talking to them about how they came to be in their current roles, what they've learned along the way, and what advice they may have for others getting into the field. These are intended to be relaxed, informal chats with professionals who are keen to share their experiences, so sit back and enjoy. In this episode of Understanding Users, Gav shares the techniques and product leadership experiences he uses when building services for organisations like NHS Digital and HMRC to solve problems for their users. He discusses how experiencing agile product delivery in government opened his eyes to a better way of building products, and the value that hyper-specialists like UX designers and user researchers bring to multi-disciplinary product teams. He also plays my 3-card challenge to share his favourite UX tool, favoured technique, and a trend he sees in the future. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. So my guest this time is Gavin. Gav has worn many hats over the years as a technology leader, strategist. He's done product, he's done senior technology roles and a bunch of other stuff, which I'm going to be asking him about. Hi, Gav. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be here. Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about what you're up to at the moment, the kind of work you do, and kind of how you got into that.
So I think it's quite difficult to pigeonhole any one thing. So the way I tend to sort of badge myself is I solve problems. And typically I solve those problems using technology. And sometimes it's with people, sometimes it's with process, but typically it's with software. And most recently, for the past how many years now, I've been building services that hopefully solve problems for people.
Right. And I know one of those kind of organizations you work with and some of the services you've been building was NHS Digital. Is that right?
Yeah, I've been working within NHS Test and Trace, within the test side for the past year, building some of the COVID testing capabilities. So what they call the asymptomatic testing. And so that's lateral flow testing in places like schools. Also the international borders testing, which we had to do in about 10 days straight, which was a little bit hair raising. So I've been doing that. And I've also been doing a lot of work with other public departments like HMRC as well. So things like ETAT to help out, sugar tax, more recently digital services tax, otherwise known as the Amazon tax, and a number of other things along the way too.
So you're a busy guy with lots of balls in the air by the sound of it. Tell me about kind of taking a step back. How did you get into digital? Give us a sort of quick, brief, potted overview of your kind of career to date. How did you kind of end up where you are now, and so how much of that was planned and how much of that was kind of coincidence or accident?
I think it kind of happened to me. I'd say it was a sort of an evolutionary process, and essentially, I was either doing systems engineering or deployments and implementations of stuff at mainly big banks back at the sort of early noughties and end of the 90s. And I realized that I liked building things. I liked solving problems. And the way I could see it best for me was to go into, well, what then didn't really exist, which was the world of product. And that was still very much an emerging subject. And it was really only when I was working with a small consultancy firm in the city who were trying to pivot into being a product organization that I started to really get to grips with the concepts such as agile and lean thinking and all of those types of sort of tools that probably all of us use on a regular basis. And gradually I sort of started going down this rabbit hole and worked out that actually the way that we'd been doing things had kind of been the wrong way. And I always thought as a product person that my ideas were the best ideas. I knew what the solution was, and it was really just about making sure everyone else were beaten to submission into building it. That I ran with for probably about 10 years, I would have thought, in terms of that sort of belligerent, rather arrogant way of doing things. And it was only really when I first started working with the government departments that I actually saw this probably a better way of doing it. And it was more because at that point you're working with real hyper specialists. On those types of teams, they are proper multidisciplinary teams where you've got representation from user researchers, interaction designers, content designers, product, everyone else. And the danger of being a product person is generally you are a generalist, so you know enough to be dangerous in each of those disciplines. But the reality is you don't obsess about each and every single one of those areas, which means that you're probably not as good as people who do. So I realized that actually there are people who are better at these things than I was. And it was really, I guess, the sort of stakeholder engagement side that I started to learn really valuable lessons, which is that it doesn't matter how good your solution is, unless you get other people to buy into it, there's no point in building it. So for me, it then really, it turned from being, right, my job is to come up with a solution, it pivoted to being, my job is to help people understand what the problem is. And to do that, you need really good evidence. And the best way to do that is to use proper UX techniques like user research and interaction design, doing lots of prototyping, iteration, test, learn, continuous improvement. And if you can do things like record those sessions, if you can get those sort of 30-second sound bites, it can really influence people's thinking. And I worked out gradually over time that, yes, I might have that solution in mind, but I've got to get people to believe in it. And the easiest way is for them to think it's their idea. So getting that collection of evidence together and real research that you can stand behind and go, well, look, don't just listen to me. I've told you this won't work. That never wins the battle. If you get them to look at it and go, oh my goodness, yeah, we've got a problem here. So, yeah, so what I think you're telling me is that if we were to do this, we might solve that problem. Great idea. When people are fed that sort of way of doing things, they bite onto it and they're far more invested in the overarching solution. And as a result, you actually get things done and it's painless. You don't end up having too many fights. So, sorry, that was a rather long-winded way of getting there, but hopefully it kind of illustrates the point.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. And that resonates very much with my own experience. And as you say, the kind of hyper specialist and bringing people with you on the journey. So kind of in terms of the impact user-centered design has on the work of, let's say, a team that you're working with kind of day to day, how would you say that?
Well, I think it's one of those areas which has really, really radically transformed certainly over the last 10 years. What used to happen, in my experience, was you'd build some software, and the job of a UXer was to make it pretty. Right, we've got a thing, make it pretty.
Make it pop.
Exactly. Yeah, I want to just, it does what it needs to do, but we need it to do it like in a sexy way. And people started to look at the sort of the design language of the likes of Apple and everything else, and they thought, oh well, we can do that. It's just a case of using nice graphics, using bevels or no bevels, flat design, Bauhaus, all these other things. Let's just jump on this trend. And they kind of missed the point. Right. Now I think people are beginning to understand that actually UX isn't just make it pretty. It's proper service design. It's solving a problem end to end. How do people get into the situation in the first place? And what do they do after they've finished using it? And digital is now morphed into something that's so entwined with how we live our lives. You have to look at the context of usage as much as anything else. My 78-year-old father is a complete techno no-no. He won't have a smartphone, but he does have a laptop that he uses to check his stocks and shares and various other bits and pieces, and gets scared by people sending him, fraudulent emails from HMRC or wherever else it is. Right. And the danger that we face today is that there's a massive range on that scale of digital inclusion, and we've got to be a lot more mindful of how that can be used, abused, and interacted with by the whole gamut of society, not just this particular thing. um,
Mm.
particularly when you're doing either public service work or more sort of consumer, so B2C type interactions.
Right, right. So talk us through a typical day as a product lead or as a product owner from kind of some of the roles you've been doing.
Well, other than being woken up at ungodly hours by young children,
Yes,
it's
I'm in the same boat.
I and then obviously being fully caffeinated. It's really about understanding what needs to be done that day. So depending on the phase or the life cycle of the service you're working with, there may be different activities. And I'm lucky to be working with a group of guys who we've actually spent nearly 4 years or 5 years working together. So we've evolved our processes and methods, and we're sort of living in almost like a post-agile era, because there is complete cohesion and trust that's been established,
Right.
which is very, very, very unusual in this type of environment. So typically we'll start off with a stand-up where we just talk about, right, after we've done the 15 minutes of chatting, stuff, because we now all live in a remote world as opposed to
Yeah.
being face to face, so we don't have that human interaction, those sort of brief snatches of conversation. We sort of formalize that by having a coffee with each other first thing in the morning. Then we just get down to business and say, right, what's going on today? What's on the timetable? Who needs to do what? What are the various challenges or areas we need to focus our efforts on? And then it'll be a case of doing whatever sessions which are required. So it might be a refinement session, it might be a workshop, for instance, a naming workshop was one we had to do yesterday, or it might be going through prototyping, coming up with various design challenges, or sometimes sort of when I put a different hat on, I'll be doing things like assessing services. So I'll be an assessor doing GDS assessments for HMRC, for
Right.
instance.
That's particularly interesting, and I'd like to come back to that a bit later. Hear more about kind of your role as an assessor. But going back to kind of the team and the way you work, I'm interested to know kind of with a product hat on, user researchers, interaction designers, kind of the other members of the team, how can they best surface what they're learning and kind of what they're doing in a way that helps the rest of the team improve and develop the service in the best way possible?
I think it depends on the maturity of the team, but
Right.
certainly when you're first starting with the team, it's really useful to get involved, get get as many people involved in what's going on as possible. Uh, People sometimes say user research is a team sport, and I know that's kind of a throwaway comment, but actually it is, and
Yeah.
it's really useful to have different eyes on the session, be able to do sort of capturing thoughts along the way, taking notes, and then feeding back after those sessions are over. I
Yeah.
really like to try and ensure that there's at least one developer in each one of those sessions.
Right. Yeah.
BA's there, often I'm there, a scrum master, whoever. And actually, the best things to have in there are stakeholders. So people who, believe that digital is this cosmic ordering service, and they're the ones with the money, so they want this thing and they need it, and it's got to look like this, and I want it in red. Um,
Yeah.
it's really useful for them to actually see real people, because they're forcing these things on them sometimes, certainly in the world of government, and it's only when they actually experience or witness what's going on the other side of the fence that they realize that actually their ivory tower needs to have windows in it.
Yes. Yeah. No. All of that sounds very familiar. Um, how can, sort of following on from that, then, how can UX folks, if I can call them that broadly, ensure that they have the biggest impact on the teams that they're working with and the services they're actually developing?
I think be really clear and stitch whatever you do into a narrative. People love stories, and for me, it's far more powerful to be able to say, look, this is what we've done, this is how we've done it, this is why we've done it. And if you can tell a story and present that back, the sort of the regular sessions, such as the sort of show and tells, that really, really helps. And that's where you really need to make sure you've got, your product lead or a delivery manager, a scrum master, call it what you will, corralling people into those sessions, and keep it really, really succinct and
Right.
on the
Yeah.
money. There's no point in saying, right, let's sit and watch a 15-minute video of someone clicking stuff on a
Mm,
screen.
mm.
If you can distill your key learnings and findings into 30-second sound bites,
Yeah.
if that 15-second sound bites even better, because particularly when we've got that dare I say Microsoft Teams fatigue and meeting
Right.
fatigue,
Yes. Yep.
working in remote style rather, you have to try and compress that now. We've got to be far more punchy about those sort of sessions. So trying to keep it brief, but also engage, that helps.
Right.
And
Right.
and also try and keep it as collaborative as possible. So this is what we've seen. These are what we feel are the impacts.
Yep.
Now, how can we solve for this? Like I said, with a product person, they'll probably already have an idea. Pretty sure an interaction designer or service designer will think that too, and probably a user researcher will, and certainly a developer will.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's really useful to sort of draw on that whole wisdom of crowds thing and
Mm,
get everyone bought into it.
mm.
No one's got a
Yeah.
monopoly on ideas.
No, absolutely. And you talked about the importance of narrative in terms of kind of bringing stakeholders with you. More broadly, what kind of personality traits do you think are important in for someone to be a good user researcher or interaction designer? Let's say, from your experience.
Without sounding too sort of touchy-feely, empathy
Mm,
is the key thing,
right. Yeah.
and it's really important that people just listen. And they might be the smartest person in the room, but they don't need to broadcast it every 5 minutes. It's it's not about us. It's about the user
Yeah.
and listening to people on the team, respect and confidence and trust.
Yeah.
But that's really more about the team dynamic as opposed to the individual.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And you mentioned before the role of GDS assessor. For those who listening to this who are not familiar with what GDS is or the assessment process, could you just give us a kind of overview of that?
Okay, so effectively, the government digital standard is actually now called the government service standard.
And this is the UK government, obviously, we're talking about.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
That started off really by the Cabinet Office, which is one of the government departments here, back in I think it was 2011. And the problem they were trying to solve is that there's a lot of money spent in technology and services being delivered across government departments, across local government, across any public service.
Mm,
The problem with that is that typically they cost a lot of money. There was
mm,
no uniformity. There were no collective learnings. There was no shared experience. And it was very jarring and for users when you suddenly go to a government service website like, I don't know, go to get your driver's license, and then you want to get a passport, and the whole thing just looks completely
mm,
different.
mm,
And there's challenges around trust because people see different branding, different interaction styles. They don't know what they're doing, and those were just a small fraction of the areas they were trying to deal with. But ultimately, they wanted to be able to give good value to the taxpayer and make sure things were being
mm.
built consistently
Yep.
and well and delivering what was required. So they put together this what they call the government digital service standard, which I think originally was something like 22 or 23 different points. It then got cut down after a couple of years to 18 points. Today, it's now 14 points,
Mm,
and essentially, it's a blueprint of how to build digital services. Or actually, it's not just digital these days. It is how to build services.
mm.
And I have to confess, I was a bit of a skeptic. I thought,
Why
oh,
so?
great. Well, you don't really think of it being a particularly dynamic or impressive environment, public sector. When I first started working with HMRC, I was honestly expecting to walk into grey cubicle land
Right.
and be dealing with drones and mainframes. And
Yeah.
that I was brought in to do some agile coaching and to do some product leadership and stuff and mentoring. I'd do a 6-month gig and off I'd trot and go and play my trade somewhere else. Actually, walking into that situation and seeing that actually for the first time ever, I've got a full team of hyper specialists.
Mm,
I'm not having to pretend to do a bit of UX, a bit of this, a bit of user research, and switch hats all the time and just clobber stuff together. I've got
mm,
people that I can say, well, actually, you know what? really use you setting up these 5 sessions over the next week with these particular types of users so we can get this type of information back. And I realized that, wow, this is actually a really, really great way of doing things. And I now would apply that and do apply that to any work I do in the private sector. For me, it is very much a best practice. And at the heart of that is all around user-centered design. In fact, I personally am more of a subscriber to I guess I'd call it goal-driven design, where, yes, the user is very much at the forefront of your thinking, but you've also then got to consider constraints. So what are your technology constraints, budget constraints, all the other things? And then also, what are the business goals that you need to try and achieve? And at that intersection point, that's where real innovation happens.
And the assessment part of that is that at certain points in the evolution of a service, as it goes through the various stages of development and design, there are examinations, for want of a better word, a kind of structured series of questions that are asked by a panel of the team designing it, and there are assessors, and your role is one of the assessors, correct? And
Correct,
just tell us
yes.
a little bit about that.
So I'm a lead assessor for
Right.
these types of things. So what happens is the service will rock up at a different phase in their life cycle. So typically we divide that into 4 different stages: as discovery, alpha, beta, and live.
Yep.
Now, typically you'll do an assessment in alpha and a beta and then live. And that's really just an opportunity for typically other government departments, because normally a panel, if it's a GDS assessment, it'll be staffed by people from different government departments, and they'll kick the tires and do a sniff test really to make sure that the service standard has been adhered to.
Right.
And really, when you look at what it is that people need to do, it should just be how we roll as teams. It should be about solving whole problems for users, identifying what their needs are, making sure you're choosing the right technology and tools. There's a myriad. I won't list off all 14 points of the standard.
You've got the T-shirt though.
Very, very much so. And some people can be quite scared by that process, and they'll go, "Oh my goodness, we've got an assessment in a week's time. Oh gosh, help! What do we need to prepare?" But again, it's back to that telling a story, creating a narrative. If this is being done properly, if you're rolling the way you should be rolling, so working in a truly agile fashion, not just doing cargo cult type, oh, we've got to do retrospectives, we've got to do sprint planning, we've got to run Scrum. That's not agile. It's are we delivering working software over comprehensive documentation? The values of agile, as opposed to this is a cookbook. If you're doing that and you're working correctly, actually, it should be quite a good experience for you to be able to come back and say, look, this is what we've done. Again, it's back to what I was saying earlier about, yes, you might have that best solution, but you've got to be able to evidence it and be able to weave that into your narrative and your storytelling of, this is the problem we're trying to solve for. These are the things we've seen along the way. This is the evidence we've got to support the hypothesis either we're going to test or that we're going to actually solve for in the next phase. And it gives you an opportunity to sort of have other people who are very good at what they do look at it and provide. I normally see it as almost like a trusted helper or friend, being able to say, oh yeah, that's interesting, have you thought about this? And often when you're working with a problem, you're so close to that problem space that you lose a bit of objectivity. So having someone else step back and provide their perspective, that can be helpful. It can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge too as well, because they'll no doubt have quite strong opinions. But I always think it's a really good thing to be challenged. And if you can't justify why you've done something, then it's quite clear that you shouldn't have done it in the first place. So
Absolutely. And do you find that some of the people coming in front of assessment panels can be defensive or evasive, or is it very much a kind of open and collaborative process?
really
If people have
depends on
asked to justify why they've done things, sometimes obviously people, if they're not confident with why they've done it, then they can default to a slightly, I guess, defensive position. I mean, I'm just interested to know if that's an experience you've had or whether people tend to be.
I've had a load of different experiences in this space. So, but on both sides of the table, where
of course, yeah,
I've ended up actually being quite aggressive almost, because the team aren't being able to articulate what they've actually been doing.
Right.
And they've gone so far outside the reservation that actually, you know what,
Right.
they need to be brought back in and told,
Yeah.
no, guys, fine, but actually you need to do these things, and here's why.
Right.
And in which case they'll fail, or sorry,
Right.
you don't use the term fail. You will not have met
That's
the
the
service
service standard.
standard.
That's right. Yeah.
At other times, I've found it really quite frustrating where people on panels, and I shouldn't really be critical perhaps, but you'll find people are being really, really dogmatic.
Right.
And yes, there are things like design patterns. Yes, there's certain things that we have to do, but there are some times where you actually have to be a bit more nimble, and you have to adapt, and you have to respond to change. And it's not always about sticking religiously to a particular design standard. If you've got evidence to support why you have done something differently, then that should be understood, and it should also feed back into the process. A good panel will get it.
Yep.
A less experienced panel perhaps won't.
Right. Right.
And I've found personally it's been quite helpful because I'm often sitting on the other side of the, as an assessor, I've been able to say, look, I understand why you're asking this, but actually, hold on, time out. You really need to consider that we're at a particular stage here, which is alpha. You are really running an assessment at this stage, which is considering us, at a point where we've got things done. That's not right.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And you mentioned you touched already on kind of the difference between public and private sector, because obviously what we've been talking about in the main is public sector work. Can you think of specific kind of differences in the way that the private sector operates and kind of does things like this? Well, broadly in terms of kind of developing software and building services.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting area to explore further, in as much as you tend to have a lot less luxury when it comes to the soft skills, let's say. So being able to have a truly multidisciplinary team.
Right.
And
You're talking
you've
about the
got,
private sector now.
yes, very
Yep.
much so. That there's much more focus on what your cost model is.
Right.
So you'll often have to rely on, say, a service designer who will come in and do user research as well as interaction design,
Right.
because you won't have the luxury of being able to afford both. Or you won't have things like a content designer.
Right.
That might be a shared resource across other teams. So you tend to do a lot more begging, borrowing, and stealing in that space.
And what impact does that have on the process of designing, testing, and building software?
I think that there's a much less of an appreciation of iterative build and release.
Right.
It's very much a case of, what's your roadmap? What are you committing to? Why hasn't it been done? And people talk about computer science. It's not computer science. It's art, and art is emergent,
Yeah.
and it's not prescriptive. And there's all sorts of things you'll find along the way that will potentially cause you to go in a different direction. So it's a lot more challenging, I've found, working within the private sector space, where you've got people who are saying, well, look, we said we were going to get this thing 6 months ago. Why haven't you done that thing? So it's I'm a big believer in making sure you can release often and show measurable improvements and growth at every
Yep.
stage, because that
Yep.
lets people understand your process a bit better, and then they step back a bit more and realize that actually you're not just sort of living in a little bit of a vacuum where they're throwing money into it and waiting for something to pop out. They're again engaged and involved. But this is particularly UX and user research in particular, and good design. It's still quite embryonic, I think, within that private sector space.
Tell me about what you love about what you do, Gav.
Oh gosh,
And conversely, what frustrates or challenges you?
The thing I like is that I have the attention span of an average goldfish, I suppose, is how I describe it. And what I do is meddle, prod,
Right.
poke, ask questions, and I love being able to look at something and have an idea, talk to others, and rely on them to actually go off and do the real clever thing of thinking and exploration. I
Yeah.
love being able to say, "Oh, what about this? And have we done that?" And look for those edge cases and come up with ideas. And I really like working with people who challenge me. And that's the fun bit. I love it when people go, Gav, you're mad. Why is that a good idea? And I go, actually, you know what? You're probably right. Perhaps there's a different way of doing things. I enjoy and I love working with people who know what they're working with and who are good at what they do.
Yeah.
The frustration is that sometimes things take a little bit too long, and that it's often a rinse and repeat of having to explain to people why things need to be done in a particular way. And
Right.
I've
And when you
got
say explain to people, are those people the stakeholders you referred to before, or members of the team, or others?
I suppose the people, when I say people, it's a slightly more traditional sense of things like project managers and people who live by Gantt charts
Right.
and budgets.
Yes.
I get that. I completely get that.
Yeah.
But there's no way that, and the number of times I absolutely lose count of the number of times people have asked me to do estimation of projects, which could take 2 or 3 years. And
Yep.
I've been asked to provide sprint plans for 2 years worth of work.
Right.
That's not how this works. You're just going to get yourself into a big, big hole.
What
It's
was your
much more
response?
No.
Simple as that.
It is. It's like, sorry, that's not how we work. What I can do is I can show you and articulate a roadmap which is aspirational. These are the things we think we know at the moment, based on the evidence we have to date. This is what we're hoping to use and do to address those particular pain points. And this is the sort of timeline we're hoping to adhere to. However, there are certain caveats. It's subject to change, and it's aspirational. This is a goal. It's not a commitment. And that's a really bitter pill for people to swallow. But again, that's where trying to establish that sort of degree of trust and showing people how you're working all the time and getting them involved in that process starts to energize them. And once they realize it, and that we're not just taking the piss, and that they're throwing millions of pounds into this black hole, and guess what? It's going to be delayed, because guess what? That's what happens with every IT project.
Infamously, yep.
What I've been very fortunate to do over the past how many years is consistently undercommit and overdeliver. So, the typical one more thing style of Steve Jobs, let's say, absolutely love it. It's great to be able to go, oh right, well we said we were going to do this thing, well we've done it, and guess what? We've also done a little bit more, and that way people start to realize that you're trying to do good work, you are doing good work, and they trust your work.
Yep. Very, very important lessons, aren't they? I say a bitter pill to swallow, but a vital pill, really, for the ultimate success of something.
Yeah, a wise man once said to me, in fact, he was a permie at HMRC, had been there for nearly 40 years. He said, stakeholders, Gavin, they're like puppies. You have to train them hard at the beginning, or they go and shit behind the sofa.
There's a wall poster for us all. Yes. Right. Last thing, my 3-card challenge, and I've been doing this with all my guests. So I've got a tool that you like using, or you particularly gravitate towards, a technique that you like. And obviously, this is in the UX space, but given with your product hat on, maybe it'll be something slightly different. So, a tool, a technique, and then a trend that you see in digital, but more specifically in kind of UX over the next kind of year or two or three. How does that sound?
Sounds good. Okay,
So
two.
we got 3 cards. You can see there's a club, a diamond, and a heart. I'm holding this up to the screen. Choose one.
I'll go for a diamond.
That is
Trend. Am I allowed to pick two?
of course.
Okay, so there are two things which I consider. One is sort of new morphisms,
Right.
as far as a sort of design system is concerned. And I know that they're very polarizing. Some people love it, some people don't.
Just explain that for those who aren't familiar with the term.
So it's essentially the new version of skeuomorphism, I guess, is in a nutshell, and it just makes interfaces look almost like plastic, I guess. It's sort of, but I love a drop shadow, and I love varying contrasts, and I'm a very visual person, so for me, aesthetically, it looks phenomenal. However, as I said, it's quite polarizing because there are certain challenges, particularly around things like accessibility, that aren't necessarily easy to solve for. But I think you're going to start seeing a lot more of those in user interfaces over the coming years. It started to become a bit of a trend last year, but more and more people seem to be jumping on it. So that's one thing. The other thing, I suspect you're going to see more of the rise of super apps. So, and if you look at a super app, so if you go back to the sort of late 90s and early noughties, you used to hear this horrible word called portal, right? I want a portal.
It still surfaces alarmingly frequently now, doesn't it?
Oh God, I'd start wanting to sort of bash my head against the wall, cut my wrists, or dive out a window whenever someone says portal. But actually, if you think about it, we have a really sort of personal interaction with these horrible things called mobile phones and smart devices and everything else. They live in our pockets. They invade our personal space. And if you look at how people interact with them, they flit in and out of one app to another, constantly bouncing around from one thing to another. And often they're doing the same thing. And often then it's just a case of slightly context shifting or switching. And there seem to be certainly in Asia, there's a sort of a trend to be able to combine things like messaging, so that you only have a single messaging app that does WhatsApp, that does Snapchat, that does all these other interactions, but it's in a single place. So you were just a user sending messages, as opposed to, oh, right now I'm in Facebook Messenger, now I'm in WhatsApp, now I'm in, what other app SMS is. It combines them all, and it does seem to be quite a big thing in Asia, and I can see it increasing. It was always shunned by Silicon Valley, but now it's, I think, going to be more of a thing.
So watch this space. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
Great. Next card.
Let's go hearts.
So the heart is
cool. My favorite tool.
Tool. Yep.
I'd love to say two things, but from a UX perspective, my favorite thing is Miro. Absolutely love it. It's for me, it's just such a useful way of being able to coalesce people around a particular area. Where I've really seen that excel has been at NHS Digital, and I've been lucky enough to work with some phenomenal service designers and see how they use it, and how we've been able to solutionize, problem solve, understand things, and use it as a way of being able to play back to stakeholders and get buy-in. It's been great, and I absolutely love that as a tool.
And by Miro, of course, we're referring to that infinite whiteboard technology that has become very, very commonly used in our world. And I agree. I use it every day, and I think it's a game changer.
Yeah. I also quite like the way you can have, there are loads of different plugins and things now. It's become its own little ecosystem.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, and last one is technique.
Depends on the life cycle or the stage where we are in a product build or service build. But one of the things I quite like doing is I probably completely missed the point, but I refer to it as anti-pattern thinking. So instead of, how do we fix something, getting everyone in the room and asking them, how do we make it worse? What are the pain points? How does that become really discussed? Instead of getting customers, how do we lose customers? How do we lose users? And that really surfaces the areas that actually cause genuine pain. And once you then start doing some affinity mapping of those concepts, it becomes very clear where the areas you need to focus on first are.
I like that. I think that's great. Handled in the right way. I can see stakeholders getting a bit nervous about that, but I think it's got a lot of power. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's pretty much everything, Gav. We've come to the end of kind of this chat, and thank you so much for sharing all of that fantastic insight. It's been really great. It's been lovely to chat to you as always, and thank you so much for your time. Thanks very much for listening to this episode of the Understanding Users podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like or comment on it on Apple Podcasts or Podbean, and feel free to share it more widely so others have a chance to listen as well. Join me again next time when I'll be talking to Katie John, Head of User Research with the digital agency Caution Your Blast in London. They're a great bunch of talented digital folks who I've had the pleasure of working with recently, and I look forward to sharing her wisdom, experience, and views on user-centered research and design with you all. Till then, stay safe and stay user-centered.